Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I want to welcome you again to Gray Associates Masterclass in Academic Program Evaluation. This is our fourth and last masterclass of 2022. Today, we'll be talking about the future of academic portfolio evaluation and management with Bob Atkins and William F. Massy. A few housekeeping items. All registrants to this webinar will receive a link to the deck and to the webinar recording later this week. If you have any questions, please feel free to click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and add your questions there. We will get to as many as we can during this session, and we'll follow up with you via email if we run out of time. That said, I will let Bob do the introductions and get us started.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and welcome everyone. This is Bob Atkins. I'm the CEO and founder of Gray Associates. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Bill Massy, and I'll let Bill introduce himself.
Hi, I'm a professor emeritus and former CFO at Stanford University and a senior consultant with Gray Associates, working on product development and advanced work. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Bill. So today we're going to talk about the future of academic program evaluation and management. This really is the capstone of a series of master classes that we've run that explain how to do program evaluation and management in today's world and the topics that you need to cover to do that well and the processes that accompany it. Today, we're going to talk about how we envision that happening going forward. And I think there are a number of changes that we should discuss together. And by the way, as we go along, I would welcome any thoughts you have in the chat screen about other things that are likely to change in program evaluation and management as we move forward. So my thought to start with is that we're going to see a much broader set of data included in program evaluations than we have in the past. Why? First, I think that there's just more things people want to consider these days. Second, just because we can. It is now possible to integrate more data than we've ever had before into these decisions. And as people realize that, more data leads to more data. So we'll see an increasing amount and an increasing pressure on us to convey that data in a way that's simple and clear, despite the underlying volume and complexity of the data itself. Now, the other dimension I think we'll see is an addition in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making that a formal part of the program evaluation process. Often people don't think of programs as having a DEI component, but they really do, because each program has its own demographic fingerprint. So if you develop your portfolio without thought of its impact on DEI, you may well be accentuating those imbalances rather than helping to address them. And last but not least, we have deeper data than what we've had before. And at its most extreme, you can go all the way down to keystrokes in your LMS to understand how an individual student may be reacting to his educational experience. A little bit higher level at the program level, we can look at touch points, messages, locations of students, for example, to anticipate who's really going to enroll in a program or not, or who might return to a program or not, as we plan out our resources. So that's a little bit of context. If you think we have too much data today, we're going to have even more, I think, tomorrow when we consider these questions. The other thing that's happening here is we're adding AI-enabled capabilities to the program evaluation process. And these are both going to be sort of what we traditionally think of from machine learning as predictive models. How many people are going to show up in the fall? Who's going to attrit? Why are they going to attrit? And then interactive capabilities that are really going to automate functions that we do today with people. For example, tutors in large part can be automated. I met with a firm just this week that can grade papers with an AI bot. And lest you think that that's sort of a fringe application, they're doing it already for the Educational Testing Service, so doing it at very large scale. So there's going to be more and more that we can do with AI, as well as make predictions.
We do have one question that popped up. Marie McLaughlin wants to know how remote work opportunities changes the program evaluation process.
That is a great question. And I believe that there are two possible answers. One is people continue to ignore it. But I think for many rural institutions, this is a huge opportunity to look at not just the local market for employment, but the national market for employment for the types of jobs that can be done remote. I'd say coding is a great example. You can be in Shanghai doing coding for a US company. In fact, as we know, many people in India are doing coding, but somehow we skipped over Iowa. We skipped over West Virginia when we made those changes. And I think those areas can be brought back into the loop, and we can put some very high paying professions into rural areas with one huge caveat. Those areas have to have broadband, which in many cases they don't. So that's a problem that we will increasingly need to fix as a nation. I think there was some funding in the most recent bill that went through Congress to do that, but you can't lay fiber optic in a day. So I think that will persist for some time. But I do think it's one of those things you need to keep in mind. And when you're looking at a program, it's worth sort of clicking on the local market and looking at the national market, because it may be the national market that you can address, that your graduates can address for employment. Now, one of the problems when you have too much data is you're going to have, and by the way, you have these great BI tools, business intelligence tools like Click or Tableau, Microsoft Power BI. You can create a new dashboard in a minute on one of those systems. And if you can, people will. And pretty soon you'll have more dashboards than you have data. It's going to become like the New York stock market. I don't know if you followed this, but there are actually more index funds in the stock market now than there are stocks. And I can imagine very easily this proliferation of dashboards. And I've already heard the first people talking about death by dashboard in their organization. These are not curated. Fortunately, you probably have data in there is curated. So at least you know what you're looking at. Whether it matters or not, you should be using it or not, that's a whole second question. And then finally, there's just this confusion between exploring data, which is great, probably one-time use dashboards, and making decisions in the dashboards you need to inform a particular decision. And those need to be created with some rigor to make sure you've got everything in one place that a decision maker needs. The data is the correct data for that decision, and it's current. I'll give you as we think about this, and we'll just use the provost as an example here, fundamentally, you need to design your dashboards around the decisions that need to get made. So at the first of these that we spend all our time on is managing the program portfolio, deciding what programs to start, stop, sustain, or grow, and thinking about what students you want, how many seats you're going to need, and what your aid policies are going to be for each of your programs. You may also want to optimize curricular efficiency, but that's actually a different set of dashboards than you need for your program portfolio. And educational quality is almost a completely different set of dashboards yet again. None of these are more or less important than the others, but the data that's going to be on them, the kinds of images and so forth are very different. Equitable student success, again, a subset of these dashboards where we track the progress of our minority students and our lower income students. We need to track research and scholarship, and we need to allocate resources. So as we think about this, each one of those decisions may need its own set of dashboards so that the right data is in front of the decision maker at the right time. On allocating resources, one of the evergreen things the provost has to do is decide whether to renew a line in a faculty when someone retires or to add one in a growing area. I believe there's a very finite set of data you might need to do that, and it'd be fairly straightforward to build the dashboards to support that decision.
Bob, can I interject here for a second? These kinds of dashboards are really morph into what we call decision support systems. That is to say, they're interactive in more ways than just navigating around data. They actually help you make the decisions. They do some calculations. They present alternatives. They allow you to do sensitivity analysis. Give some examples of that in a few minutes. So these are a really very special and focused kind of dashboard.
Thank you, Bill. Let's take a look at one specific example many of you will recognize, but let's look at this question of managing a program portfolio and focus in on that and the kinds of dashboards you need to be effective there. So a little bit of context. To make program decisions, we believe you need data on 4 areas: mission, academic standards, markets, and margins. And so we need sheets and dashboards that bring those things together, both and show them individually in more depth, but also summarize them. So the addition here is equity. And all of these attributes impact equity. For example, many of us are familiar with the issues that underserved students have in graduating, much lower graduation rates than our more affluent students. Many minorities also have lower graduation rates, not all. So that academic part of the institution or academic metrics needs to be able to address that and keep track of it. So let's take a look at Gray's solution here. You all have seen this if you've been in our prior classes, but the point here is not to go through the details, but to say one-page summaries, in our opinion, really help. As you get used to them and using them, you can take a look at a page like this and understand almost at a glance what the decision would be about this program. We're looking here at the national level. All our indicators are color-coded, so you can see it's dark green for student demand and employment. I'm good to go there. I'll come back to that. And I'm pink on competitive intensity. So the color coding helps me to understand what's going on. That is based on percentiles. Very important concept. All too often we present numbers without context. So it's very difficult to know what they mean. For example, a Google search volume here, 611,928 searches in the prior 12 months. Well, I would be hard pressed to know if that's a lot or a little, especially if I were looking at this not nationally, but in Dubuque. What is a lot of, Google searches in Dubuque? So percentiling the answers for a market helps people to be able to understand and interpret the data you're presenting. So just the main point here, though, is to find ways to present your data in a very succinct way and then be consistent in how you present it so people get accustomed to looking at it in a certain form. That reduces, if you will, cognitive load. People can look at what the page is telling them without having to fight through, what is this particular data element? How's it being displayed? What does it mean? If you can be consistent about how you show these things, makes a big difference in people's ability to absorb them. And their ability to absorb is not going to go up. All our attention spans are going down, and the amount of data we're putting out there is going up. So we really need to pay a lot of attention to how we present the data.
Bob, can you talk a little bit more about how to have your team support implementation and use of a dashboard like this?
Well, the first is you got to have it. Second, you're going to have to train your users, and we certainly support that. The training has to take a couple of forms. One I would call conceptual. Why are we doing this? What are the big categories that we have to think about? And what's their role in the decision-making process? And then finally, how do you actually read the data on the system itself? And what's the purpose of each data element you have? And there's one other thing there. Be careful about simplifying things down to one data source. You'll have heard this in our prior webinars, but there is no data source I'm aware of around higher ed that doesn't have its issues. So you're going to want more than one so that you have different perspectives. For example, on student demand. Some of the sources are old, some of them are a bit squirrely. So you really want to be able to look at 2 or 3, and you'll be more comfortable when they all agree. But no one source is definitive. Labor markets is another great example for that. The BLS forecasts are wonderful. It's nice that they make them. It's just that they're seldom correct. So 82% of those forecasts are off by 50% or more. So yes, you'll want to have other sources for information about what's growing or shrinking. I think those are the big things. Have the right concepts, create things that are easy to read, and then spend the time to teach people how to read the specifics, and make sure you've got more than one source. So let me come back to the message here. What we've got here is a one-page summary of a program that brings in all 4 categories of information. On the prior page, we looked just at the market. Here we're looking at mission, markets, academics, and mission, what have I missed? Mission margins, all in one spot. In the upper left corner, if somebody wanted to read this very quickly, they can see I'm green on markets, mission, and academics, and I've got something going on with margins that's not in line. Also, very easily, you can see the overall evaluation of this program. This is a sustain at this particular organization. And I can come down quickly and see what's going on in my markets. For example, I'll check my pinks, and I can see growth is only in the 4th percentile. That's a little bit worrisome. And employment is only at the 46th percentile. About average. That's not the end of the world, but it's not fabulous either. And then finally, competitive intensity is beginning to get up there at the 75th percentile. And I could dive into margins here as well and see what's going on. I've got the summary margin data. Any of these things you can dive back through and see what's going on in more detail on a separate dashboard. And then importantly, I've got the academic data that I can keep track of. And this one's pretty interesting. I've got a decline in the number of students, which is in itself worrisome in a big program like this. My credit hours taught are going down. And then jumping down, there are some things that are getting better. Number of students with more than 15 credit hours up slightly. And importantly, the withdrawal DFW rate is going down. And as a result, my number of completions is going up, even though my number of students has declined. So that could just be a lag, but it also could be that we're actually getting people through the program more effectively. Then we come to the demographics. You can see up in the upper right corner, this program, almost exclusively white. I don't know why. It is interesting. It is a balance of male and female, but very few minorities are in this particular program at this illustrative institution. And I can come down and click through and see what's going on in each of these metrics for both by gender, age group, health status, and ethnicity. So I've got a way very quickly of understanding the impact this program is having on diversity and equity and inclusion at my campus. So that's one view. And then you're going to want to be able to step back even a further level if you're the provost or even a dean and you've got dozens of programs that are reporting up to you, and be able to at a glance understand which program I need to pay attention to. And that's what this dashboard is intended to illustrate. And I can, if I were live in our systems, you could sort, for example, on job postings and see which fields have the most promising job prospects. That might be an area you'd want to make sure you're covering. But I'm going to dig into two programs here that I noticed pretty quickly using the system. So this one looks worrisome to me. I'm in orange almost all the way across in the market. I've only got 20 job postings, which is a very low number. My completions in the market are down 46%. So the popularity of this program overall has been declining. And in fact, it's been declining at my school. It's gone down by 3 students or 23%. And looking over to the right, whenever I see a decline in volume, I worry about my costs, because the costs generally don't change. I'm going to end up having to teach the same courses. I just don't have enough students in them. And sure enough, we've had a 39% increase in cost here. My cost per student credit hour is $549. And that compares to benchmarks in our system of $200. So this one's over by a whopping $349 per credit hour. Most likely not because we have too expensive instructors. The problem here is we don't have enough students going through their classes. So again, at a glance, I can understand what's going on and figure out where I need to spend my time in addressing issues. And not all issues are bad. Here I've got the business program, same page. You can quickly pick up high job area. In the market, it's declining, but not at my institution. My enrollment's actually up, which is great to be able to beat the market. And that has all kinds of wonderful impacts on my financials. My revenue's up 8%. My cost per student credit hour is actually up, which is a little worrisome, up 10%, but I'm still well below the benchmark. So I could be very comfortable with that number if it didn't persist in rising faster than my growth rate. So again, it's just intent is to have a panel where you can go. And in this case, I might want to be thinking about adding resources to help out with the loads. While over in athletic training, I'd want to be taking a careful look at that and making sure I'm making the best use of the resources I have. Now, there are all kinds of other fun things you're going to be able to do, especially with AI. And there are tools now that are available to work in AI that allow not quite me to do this work, but pretty normal analysts. You no longer have to be a specialist. You don't need to know R in order to do AI analytics. You do need data. So one of the things that we've built over time, as you all know, is a huge database on education statistics. And as we do work with our clients in economics, we're getting a lot of data for each institution, which, by the way, we only use for that institution, to be able to build models of how their institution is going to behave over time. One of those questions is, if I launch this program, how big will it be? A related question is, I know I've got 100 students in that program. Is that good, or should I have expected to get more? And the models can help you with that. So we built something with about 50 metrics in it. over 500 classification of instructional programs, SIPs, that's programs. And we included 1,300 institutions, 3 award levels. And this may seem like a lot, but in practice, this is sort of bare minimum in order to do big data analytics. Then we ran one, what we call the layer 1 prediction, which is a way of an initial prediction to categorize the data. And then we ran a second prediction to actually draw out the numbers. And that actually, we ran 3 or 4 different models, and we averaged out the results in what's called an ensemble model prediction. So a few layers here. Sounds, like it's very complex. And in fact, we were sitting on top of Google's BI engine when we did this, but even that's fairly easy to use. And there are other apps like Kraken, which is a BI app for mortals that allows all of us to get in there and be doing this type of analysis. You do have to be careful. It's pretty easy. You got a power tool, and you want to make sure when you take out that chainsaw, you don't take off any body parts in the process. So if you have someone that is more expert, oftentimes a great combination is to take a regular old analyst and let them have at it, but then have an expert take a look at it, much less time required, and make sure they haven't done anything untoward. Very easy to restructure these models once you have the data set up. Of course, the other thing I should remind you of is that in modeling, 80% of the time is spent cleaning the data, not doing the models. So that part hasn't changed a whole lot. There are tools for it, but it still requires a lot of careful analytical work and attention. Now, how accurate was this model? What we got it to over the course of several iterations, we could predict when we predicted something was large, it would be either large or medium 86% of the time. 55% would actually be large, according to the breakpoints we set up with this client. Now, the reason we grouped 2 is that you're always going to have edge cases that sit right between the breakpoint between large and medium. So there really isn't any meaningful distinction, except that you have to put a breakpoint somewhere in the data. And what we're really trying to prevent when we do program launches, we want to make sure we don't put a bunch of money into something that's actually going to end up being very small. So the model is really quite good at avoiding that problem. We're down to only 8% of the programs that were small or very, small or very small. I think it's actually 14%. That's a typo. My apologies. And you can see for medium, we did fairly well too. And very small, we were able to predict with, again, 86% accuracy, though hopefully you're not examining any of those programs. Again, 2 applications. One, looking at possible new programs for you, because when we do this, we forecast for all programs in a given degree level. So we can tell you not only how big your programs would be, but how big programs that you're not yet offering should be at your institution. Now, another layer of this is the application of financial markets portfolio theory to higher ed. This may seem pretty far-fetched, but there are concepts here that are very valuable. Beta is one of them. Beta is the volatility of a given stock. Well, programs have volatility too. I think we've seen some that tend to rise and fall with no apparent reason from year to year. Others that are very steady. You think of nursing. You're almost always going to fill that class, although COVID threw a bit of a wrench into that too. But some are just much more volatile than others. And so if you build a portfolio of those volatile programs, you're likely to have a more volatile overall mix. And your enrollment from year to year is going to jump around quite a bit. There is an exception to that, though. Not all programs rise and fall at the same time. So on this chart, you can see respiratory therapist grew pretty nicely from 800 to 1,600 students in the time between 2010 and 2020, 10 years. Cognitive science also grew even faster rate from 500 to 2,500 completions over that time period. But what you see in the data is different periods of rise and fall. So in respiratory care, we had a dip between 2012 and 2013. At that same time period for cognitive science, it was actually growing. See another dip in respiratory care in 2018, 2019. Cognitive science went through that more or less unscathed. But cognitive science had a dip here in 2016, and that same year was actually a big year for respiratory care. So we put these two together, we get a much less volatile growth pattern. Almost no dips, straight line rise. And what's happened is the variations in one program have offset the variations in the other. So we get a much smoother rise. For those of you who are math folks, this is known as negative correlation. Again, a concept from the stock market and portfolio theory, that we can construct a portfolio that will be lower risk, but have the same overall return by combining the right, in that case, stocks, but in this case, programs. So what I would say is, as you're making program decisions, this is kind of a last check. You're probably not going to come in and say, okay, let's find us a program that dampens the volatility of our portfolio. But you are going to want to check and make sure that you're not adding programs systematically or growing programs systematically. They're going to increase the volatility of your portfolio, unless you like to take risk, which is certainly not my favorite thing. Now, one of the things I've been working on, and here again, I welcome any comments that folks have, is trying to create a formula that will give an expression of the degree to which we're achieving equity, diversity, equity, inclusion goals. So far, I've come up with my favorite formula I call Jeff, the Gray Equity Opportunity Formula. And it's really a calculation of the value of the gaps in opportunity so that we can see how much money there is from a student perspective in closing those gaps. And we could call it an inequity formula, that would be fair, but a very negative cast. I think here it's the opportunity to improve the equity of our programs. Fundamentally, that has three components. Am I admitting people in a way that represents my community? So, or have I got groups that are systematically underrepresented, particular concern to the underserved and minorities? I can translate that into dollars by making a heroic assumption that if I've got, let's say, let's pick green people. If I've got 10% green people at my school and in my admissions class, 15% in the community, I've got a 5% gap there. I can multiply 5% times my student body, which is how many incremental green students I would need in order to close the gap. And then, the folks that don't go to college make less than folks that do. So I could multiply that number of students by the cost of not attending college, which would be the difference in those two income streams. Now I can go on to the next step, which is once students are in school, oddly enough, they systematically take different programs. And lower income and minority students tend to take programs that lead to lower income areas. And I think this is not really colleges don't cause this problem. I think it comes from societal stereotypes and probably some steering that we do unintentionally at the college level. Although I know many of you have tried to address this, particularly for things like women in engineering. It's going to be a tough one to fix, but nonetheless, it has an impact on their graduating income because they tend to go into programs that earn less. And then finally, the graduation rate has an impact. If they don't graduate, their earnings are impaired, and we can calculate all that and actually turn it into a dollar value of opportunity that we can address and improve. So that's the concept. We're beginning to apply this. Most of these numbers you could use iPads to calculate and create indexes that you could look at and comparators. Obviously, internally, you've got better and more current data than that, where you could calculate out this ratio, this formula, and get a starting point for your work on equity and inclusion. I'd be careful. The dollar value in and of itself is not going to be critical. The question is it getting better or worse? And the other part that this helps with is being able to look at each of these three buckets and decide where you believe the leverage is to improve that. So it may be I need to be better at admitting. It could be that I need to be much better at graduation, and at other institutions, perhaps there's more room to improve program selection. But the right expenditure, investment, improvement may be different from institution to institution, as well as over time. I mentioned that there are systematic biases in enrollment. What you're seeing here is for two-year colleges, associate programs, and the orange bars are programs that are 75% male. The green bars are 75% female, and the gray is a balance of men, a better balance of men and women. And what you see on the page is almost all but three of the programs that are highest earning at the associate level in North Carolina are predominantly male. Three are not. And one important point here that was raised is that it doesn't lead to quite what you would think, because some of the nursing in particular, for example, is a huge program, and nurses do earn more than most of the other professions on this page. So if you looked at it in terms of average wages on graduation adjusted for the population, the women actually do come out slightly ahead here, but there's a missed opportunity, if you will, in going into programs that may earn even more than nursing. And at the bachelor's level, this problem gets more extreme. Here you can see the percentage of folks who end up in the lowest income group we were tracking in ACS. And men and Asians have the lowest representation in these very low income programs that lead to low incomes. And you can see Blacks and women tend to over-enroll in those programs. And Hispanics, same, but a little bit less so. So again, this is one of the things you want to keep an eye on and make sure that on your campus, you encourage folks to take, well, that's not quite the right way to say it, that you enable people to take the programs that are best for them and not necessarily follow the herd of their demographic group.
Bob, we have a question about the Jeff analysis. Have you also looked at differences in financial aid across demographic groups related to program costs to the students and the university, as well as the long-term debt?
Great question. Have not done that yet. And it is a potentially really good addition here, sort of net cost of college by group, which would be, an effective an investment component to this. So it is an important area, and there are significant variations in the financial aid net cost of college by group. So good point, good add. Completion gaps, we may hope they're rising, they're not, or improving. Not at all clear that they are. And one group I find on here very interesting is that whites are actually completing at a lower than average rate because some other groups are coming up. So this sense that, underserved white Americans are falling behind looks as though it's true. And chances are that's driven primarily by the college education gap in men. Men are now only 40% of college attendees. So we've got a very significant shortfall in their representation on campus. And I believe that's probably what comprises most of this 8% in terms of completion rates. Because not only do they not go to college, they have a lower odds of graduating as well. In any case, if you're hoping this is all getting better, I don't see that in the data yet. Last but not least, across the spectrum, with the addition just mentioned, I think we're going to see the ability to create AI stimulus and response models. That is, models allow you to predict which of these, what's going to happen with each of these variables and how that equity gap is going to change, but also automated AI-driven things like chatbots that will actually interact with students to help improve these things. Let me hand it over to Bill.
Okay, well, I would like to take on a rather different subject. It relates to academic standards, part of the overall picture here. It's the notion of education quality. And it's something, it's the elephant in the room. We all think about it. It's generally regarded properly as something for faculty initiative, but it turns out that provosts can have a great deal of influence about that. And most of the time they don't. And so I want to dig deep, a little bit deeper into that. And it turns out that AI does have some things to contribute in that field. Bob? Next slide. The institution is I'm sorry, if you go back for a second, I want to lead into this a little bit more. It turns out that there is more to education quality than curriculum and stand-up teaching and direct student contact, and in particular, educational objectives, teaching methods, and so on. These are all important. These are things, teaching methods and course design are major factors in determining the delivered quality of education. Student learning assessment is important because the faculty aren't really doing a good job of evaluating their students and their own performance. It's difficult for them to improve. Turns out there's also a bunch of modern quality principles defining, and there's some things we've learned from the quality movement in the last 30 or 40 years around the world. that apply here. They apply very well, although we don't use them as often as we should. Just a couple of these are defining quality in terms of outcomes, not incomes, not inputs. And we spend a lot of time in universities talking about inputs, things like faculty teaching loads and so on, not as much talking about the actual quality, the performance of students. It's getting better, but there's still a long way to go. In order to improve on all of that, we need to focus on how things get done. It's all in the process. The devil is in the details. And how faculty do what they do is extremely important. Working collaboratively is also very important for faculty, as is basing decision on evidence. And it's really important to have coherence in your teaching approach. All things that faculty can do, they try very hard, they want to produce quality, but they don't really have the tools and they don't have the feedback systems in order to do it. So turns out that departments that produce exemplary education quality do take collective responsibility for all of these things. And they do that while continuing to emphasize individual faculty initiative. And in fact, what they are doing, or what they end up doing, is embedding a self-reinforcing culture of quality, as it were, in their education quality work. And it turns out I've done this many times, 50, 60 times with individual departments in this area. And it turns out that faculty really are pleased to participate in these processes, and they lead them once they're given a sense of direction and tools, and the tools to do it. I've written a couple of books, one on this particular subject called Academic Quality Work. And so you could get more information there. Now this slide. The journey ends up with this business, this thing on the right-hand side of this chart called mature effort. It's a ladder. It shows the steps in the process and the journey of getting from a traditional view of basically individual faculty initiatives with little tracking and little consciousness about the quality beyond the notions of direct classroom teaching and individual work with students, less, not enough attention to things like education, which teaching and learning methods and assessment and so forth. And then you end up with all of these things embedded as mature effort in the department. And I won't read all of them, you can read them, but there's been a good deal of work now which shows how departments can go up the steps of this ladder. They begin by firefighting, just solving problems. They're kind of in a reactive mode, but they begin to get some experience dealing with these things. They then get what we call emergent effort, individual quality improvement initiatives, and then more organized effort, and finally mature effort. This is something that we would like our departments to move up this ladder. The question is how to do it. Next, Bob. Next slide. It turns out that there is a way, the way in which provosts can be successful in influencing all of this is to encourage and organize, persuade the faculty to do self-assessments of their quality, not their teaching, not just their teaching, but to hold all of the dimensions of education quality, the ones I mentioned, for example. Faculty self-assessments, but those by themselves don't usually get the job done. And the reason is faculty are very busy, they're distracted. You write a nice report, not a lot happens as a result of it. And indeed, there's a great deal of variation in the degree of depth and breadth of these reports when you see faculty do them. So what you need is peer review of these self-assessments, the faculty self-assessments, and also the underlying data. They look at some of the underlying data, that they see what faculty is using. Do they have a lot of data about the quality of their educational delivery, or don't they? Basically, a rule of thumb here is if you don't have much data, you don't measure, you don't pay much attention, you're probably not doing nearly as well as you could. Now, and the trouble with all of this is that the peer reviews tend to be a bit of the expensive side, and sometimes they're viewed as intrusive. And so what we're hoping for here, what the idea is, that AI can learn to evaluate both kinds of assessments, the faculty self-assessments and the peer reviews and the underlying data, and begin to be able to make predictions about, as on the right here, predictions about what the peer review would say, or indeed, more fundamentally, what the actual position of the ladder is. This looks eminently possible. There's a lot of data that's generated, more data really than one can assimilate in a real situation, and a tremendous amount of underlying data about student performance, in fact, the way faculty teach, and so forth. And so if we can get that, get AI to work on that, to be able to produce some predictions, then we will be able to track our performance over time. Next, back on the ladder, and we can tell whether individual departments, where they are on this ladder, and that will be tremendously important, because it'll help deans and the provost working through deans to decide what kind of effort, where to put your effort. I've done this work, for example, in real institutions where we've evaluated the performance of departments on these quality dimensions. And we find in a given school under a particular dean, let us say that some, like 1 or 2 departments have really doing a wonderful job. They're quite mature. And you can tell, by the way, you can learn this in half an hour or an hour when you go in and start talking to faculty. And if they're doing a lot, they'll talk your arm out, talk your arm off. And if they're not, they'll sort of say, well, we know quality when we see it and we're doing a good job. You can tell the difference between that and the other steps, particularly the no effort and firefighting. And so you go and you tell a dean, you talk to a dean after you've done these evaluations, the peer review evaluations. You say, look, Department A is very mature. Department B is down there and no effort or firefighting and don't seem to care about it. What can you do? What's to be done about this? And we would find we'd get 1 of 3 responses. One would be a good response from the dean and say, gosh, I was sort of aware of that, but I don't know what to do. Let's talk about what to do. And so we'd have a good conversation and the dean would then get some momentum. A second possibility was the dean, we saw from many deans, where I had no idea, absolutely no idea. So is it any wonder that departments just persist in their behavior with no change really over time, stasis? And then a third response, the worst one by far, is deans say, yeah, I'm sort of aware of the difference. It's not my responsibility to do anything about it. At which point we say, well, whose responsibility is it? And they usually say, well, it's some committee or other. And that never works. It has to be the dean that does this. So anyway, with a tool, an AI assisted tool that will monitor performance along these dimensions, even very roughly, you'd have the kinds of conversations you need within institutions to improve continuously on your education quality. And this would really be a force multiplier in terms of the way you use your teaching resources, because it doesn't take extra money to do this stuff. It just takes the right kind of focus and attention. Be a real game changer. Next, please.
Yeah, and Bill, I don't see this being that far-fetched. Essentially, with today's world tools, if you had a body of evaluations, self-evaluations, and a body of the peer reviews, the tools are pretty good at interpreting that and being able to mimic what they've seen. So you do need a fairly large data set to start with, but think 200 or 300, not thousands. And then I don't know how somehow inside the box, it figures out what's going on and can generate these things.
That's exactly what's needed. Yeah. And there may be some availability of such archives. That's going to take a little digging, but I myself participated in Hong Kong over a 5-6 year period. We did 2 evaluations on each of our dozen institutions, 10 institutions actually, and wrote reports on each one of them. And then I wrote an overarching report. And unfortunately, those are no longer on the web, but if we could find those or something equivalent, some states have done it here. I think it would be a practical thing. Or we could begin to do it ourselves. I mean, institutions can do some of this, and we kind of bootstrap our way in, especially with some cooperation amongst institutions.
Great.
Next. The last topic I want to mention is this business of resource allocation and what's happening there. This is really a great interest of mine, and it has to do with how you integrate a model, the various models that we have in program evaluation, program review, and curricular efficiency, and so on. How you put it all together on a single platform that allows provosts and deans too, although this is probably more a provost proposition in most schools, to work with this stuff in an integrated and effective way. There's several components to it. First of all, there's the models themselves. They're both deep and broad. Deep in the sense they run from campus all the way down to departments and courses, individual course sections. They include programs and schools and so forth. So it runs the gamut of what goes on in the academic side of the institution. Broad in the sense that they deal with not only with all students as a group, but they can deal with student segments and cohorts. So you could do this analysis for Pell students, non-Pell students, disadvantaged students, if you wish, however you want to cut your student data. And there's a lot of ways to do that, have the data to do it. And then you can do it, by looking at student cohorts, that is first, second, third year and so forth in the program, you can analyze persistence, graduation rates from the bottom up, which is the only way to really do it effectively. And you do that by student segment. So these models they all exist now in one form or another. But what we're doing now is we're working on a platform that's going to put them all together. There's also a dynamic component to this. And in order to really be effective at planning and financial budgeting and planning and so forth, you need to consider more than 1 year. We typically look at a budget and we say, okay, we're going to do that budget and then we'll go on to the next year when we get there. But you really have to worry about long-term effects. You have to worry about financial sustainability, and namely that you can easily balance it. Well, easily is too strong a word. I was acting provost at Stanford, vice provost for a number of years, and CFO for many years. And I could always balance a budget for a year to two. I could usually find enough stuff to put in or adjust, but it wasn't sustainable. I had to make fundamental changes in order to make it sustainable. Well, what these models do, what the platform that it will do, is we'll take the upcoming year, start where you are now, a base year, and then it'll take the next year is the budget year. The budget, you're actually setting that budget. And then it'll deal with 1, 2, or maybe 3 forward-looking years. And then something which we call a steady state, which is where things ought to be financially sustainable. They ought to be in equilibrium. And that's equivalent to the terminal year when you do an MBA style cost analysis. That's where things are stabilized. So you look at it over time, and then you can dig down into all of these boxes for any year. And you can adjust variables. You can adjust primary planning variables, looking at the campus level, or you can go down and adjust variable plans, things you can do, tool adjustments, things you can do at the school program course level and so forth. And then you can analyze it. And what this does is it gives you the opportunity to try different possibilities, possible strategies. We call this scenario planning, because when you think of all of the decisions and the background information underlying data that's in the model, that all comprises a scenario, a collection of plans and events which together will produce an output. Well, with a model like this, we're going to be able to not look at just one scenario where we sweat it through for months and crunch the data. We can look at multiple scenarios, and somebody gets an idea or worries about something that might happen. we can test it very quickly. So this is practically, we're practically extant, and it's going to be a very powerful application. It'll fit under the AI envelope, although it's not so, these are structural models as a rule. Or most of the elements are structural models, that is to say their equations and so forth, not machine learning. Nevertheless, it's a kind of artificial machine intelligence in support of the budget process. So I think this is a very exciting development, and we look forward to talking about it further in the future. Bob, back to you.
Thanks. Many of you may be asking, how do I prepare for a future that's got AI? And it's a great question. I ask myself inside our firm as well. I think there's a fundamental answer that is collect the data. All these AI applications require large data sets in order to train, to learn. And so to the extent you've got those, the machines will be able to learn very quickly. If you haven't collected the data, then in effect, the launch of your AI will be delayed by the time it takes you to collect adequate data to teach the machine. So there are all sorts of systems that you may want to make sure you're archiving the data in a way that it can be accessed, and later on that it can be run through the machines to perform a particular task. Right now, you may not even know what that task is, but if you have the data, it's relatively easy to stand up an application. The data is really the biggest constraint. You can't hothouse it in most cases. If you haven't collected it, it's simply not there. So that would be my advice. If you're trying to get ready, it's a place to start. Obviously read up. And then, there are vendors who will talk your ear off about what they can do with AI in order to give you a sense of the capabilities. But it's getting more and more robust. And I think AI and this need for scaled data is going to lead us to a fundamentally different architecture. This is, and it's going to be an architecture that spans institutions. So it's not about what you build by yourself, because it's very quickly going to become cost prohibitive for you to try and build these systems yourself, or even maintain them for that matter. So I envision the creation of institutional communities. Now, not a new concept. We've got the Council of Independent Colleges, and they do share some things. State systems may share choices. When I say state systems, I mean the state governing entity may share software systems. In some states, it's in some parts of their structure, it's really running off one system. But these communities then can lean on the vendors or build their own as a community. And it really starts by giving data into a shared data store. So someone was asking about tools in our interactions. I would suggest that probably the answer here at some level is the bottom of the pyramid is Snowflake or Google BI, one of a half dozen systems that can really store an enormous amount of data, terabytes on terabytes, and do that in a way that is still accessible and where the cost for pure storage is not very high. That way you can put it there. And in many, like Snowflake, you don't pay a lot for it to be there. They get you when you go query the data. That's going to, in turn, engender a second layer of applications. We use Click, for example, for reporting. These things are often called BI tools, business intelligence tools. And many of you are familiar with Tableau, but there are half a dozen of them. And having recently shopped for them, they are kind of all alike, and each has some unique benefits, but so this data will be interpreted, if you will, through BI applications, and there'll be AI systems that sit off to the side of that and use the data to make projections, but more importantly, to actually do things. So we're going to go beyond dashboards and predictive analytics, and in fact, we already are, into actual automation of work, and importantly, automation of interactions with key constituencies, students, potentially parents, and so forth. And those are going to sound an awful lot like a human being. And the only difference is they're awake 24 hours a day, and they do what you tell them to do. So if you tell them to do something incorrect, they'll do it as well. But they're predictable, they're repeatable, and they need not sound like an automated response. And I see huge opportunities here. You're beginning to see, as an example, the first chatbots are going to address mental health and actually be interacting with students around mental health issues. I just read about one that significantly improved some expressions of depression and actually retention in a small test. So there's some intriguing things happening there.
Bob,
And of course, all of you are familiar with chatbots at this point.
I think it's important to emphasize that these are not intended to replace human judgment where it really is needed. It's intended to leverage it and to allow you to do things at scale that you can't do with pure human interaction.
That's
but
true.
human is still very much in the picture.
And well, maybe or maybe not, actually. Depends on the application.
Depends, but in the
But if we
detail,
take-
but humans are monitoring it all the time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It turns out one of the challenges here, if we take chatbots, is not generating the conversation; it's moderating it and pacing it. Chatbots pretty quickly, the students will turn it off if you send them too many messages, and the system is happy to send out messages and probably has custom messages for them. But well, you all have probably familiar with this, but you can only send so many before they turn off the stream. But I'm very intrigued, for example, on the mental health side. Personally, I think there are real opportunities here to provide tier 1 mental health support, and I think it's an important issue because, frankly, tier 2, the real psychologists and psychiatrists are in very, very short supply. We just don't have enough of them to address the scale of the problem we have. So we're going to need to come up with automation, not to replace humans, but really to augment the capabilities in that particular area. There are other areas where we can take care of whole interactions with students without human intervention in a way that's actually preferred by students. But the other things you get once you start to have common data stores is benchmarking information that's consistent across institutions, scale and development of these applications, and reporting so that they're cost effective for your institution. You don't have to go home grow all these dashboards. They're expensive to create. What people forget too is it's enormously expensive to maintain this stuff. I've been surprised, running my company, that I thought once I built applications, I was kind of done. And we're now spending more money in maintenance than we are in development. So be wary there as you start to do this yourself, that you're creating a never-ending cost stream. And then finally, taking all that back to the institutional communities so that they have a set of dashboards that's constantly growing without incremental cost. I think the right model for this is actually to build something that's a membership where the membership fee is fixed and the applications get better and better over time with direction from the members of the community about which apps to build when. And when I say apps, that may be a little bit bold for what I'm thinking of. I'm really thinking more of dashboards than, for example, ripping and replacing your SIS. But I think that way we'd have a community-directed set of development priorities. Communities would get a predictable cost level, and the systems that they get would get better and better over time. And again, you take advantage of the scale opportunities that are available when you're working across multiple institutions. One nuance here is to make that really work, the data from each institution will need to run through a filtering system that puts it into a common data dictionary so that you can write a report once and publish to each institution. Of course, each institution will be looking only at its own data, but the reporting mechanism itself will be the same. So it saves a lot of money, I think, potentially there. So that's my vision of where I think this is going to have to go, because the requirements for building this are going to be too expensive for all but the biggest institutions. And it's also true in this day and age that if you have the money, it doesn't mean you can hire the people. Very short supply of people that know how to do this stuff, and that may turn out to be the real constraint. So with that, I hope we've given you some new ideas for how to go about program evaluation and management, what's coming your way. This is the last of the master classes. If you want to go back over any of the material or you want a deeper dive, we do have a course available to you. We run in partnership with Bay Path University, and please feel free to avail yourself of that. It's 6+ hours of training material. It's very helpful, especially for anybody who wants to lead the program evaluation and management process at an institution, to have really a roadmap for how to do that. And last but not least, of course, I have to plug my book. It is now on Amazon, though not actually out yet. The 24th, they'll actually start shipping copies, but you can go to Amazon and find it and place your early order. Start, Stop, or Grow is our best thinking on how to do program evaluation and management and move towards a more data-informed, rigorous process. And I should say also participative process for doing that. So thank you all very much. We're open for questions. Hopefully I answered the question about our systems and techniques in that last chart. If there are others, we'd be happy to take them. Just enter them either in the chat or the Q&A, either one I'm keeping track of.
I also wanted to mention that you can find a link on Bob's website, robertgrayatkins.com, if you'd like to pre-order the book.
In case anybody's wondering why my website has such a pretentious name, it's because anything short of that, you end up seeing Diet Doctor books from, by the way, Robert Atkins, no relation. So yeah, that's why it's robertgrayatkins.com. So thank you all very much. I usually don't get a lot of questions at the end, so that looks like it's going to be the case today too. Feel free to email me as well. That's just bob.atkins@grayassociates.com if you'd like to give us a question.
Or bill.massy@grayassociates.com.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.